There are moments in life when silence becomes louder than words ever were. When someone chooses to walk away from a connection that once held meaning, they may believe they are stepping into freedom. But freedom without inner alignment is not peace, it is delay. Delay of feeling, delay of truth, delay of what the soul already knows but the heart has not yet accepted. What often follows avoidance is not immediate clarity but distance. And in that distance, life continues to speak, not in punishment, but in reflection. Because every choice carries a mirror, and every mirror eventually reveals what the noise once concealed. There comes a point where distractions lose their sweetness, where new environments still feel strangely empty, where laughter does not fully reach the places within that were once softened by genuine connection. And in those quiet hours, what was dismissed begins to return not as memory alone, but as understanding. This is how the human heart is designed. It does not forget truth easily. It only postpones it. And postponement always has an ending. But the deeper principle here is not about anyone falling apart. It is about awakening. Because sometimes life does not break a person down to destroy them, it breaks the illusion so they can finally see clearly. And clarity, though uncomfortable, is sacred. What was once taken for granted begins to reveal its value in hindsight, not because the past can be reclaimed, but because awareness has finally matured. And maturity often arrives dressed as regret, not because it is meant to punish, but because it is meant to teach. And yet, the most powerful transformation is not found in watching someone realize what they lost. It is found in understanding what you were meant to learn from being left behind, because your worth was never dependent on someone's timing or emotional capacity. It was always intact. When someone exits your life without full understanding, they are not only leaving you, are also stepping into their own lessons. And life, in its quiet intelligence, ensures that every soul eventually meets what it avoided. So do not anchor your peace in someone else's realization. Anchor it in your own expansion. Because the highest truth is this: what is meant for you will never require emotional confusion to prove its value. And what leaves was never meant to define your wholeness. And in time, everything finds its place, not always in reunion, but always in understanding. Emotional avoidance is rarely what it appears to be on the surface. It is not strength, even though it often disguises itself as control. It is not clarity, even though it presents itself as certainty. It is, in its quiet truth, a postponement of feeling. A delay of emotional responsibility that does not erase what is real, it only pushes it into the background of the mind, where it waits patiently for its return. When someone chooses to leave a meaningful connection from a place of avoidance, they often believe they are freeing themselves from discomfort. They mistake emotional intensity for emotional incompatibility. They confuse depth with pressure. And in that confusion, they step away thinking they are choosing peace. But what they are often choosing is distance from themselves. Because the relationship was not only with another person, it was also a mirror that reflected parts of them they were not yet ready to face. In the beginning, avoidance feels like relief. The nervous system calms, the emotional noise reduces, and there is a temporary sense of control. But life does not remove lessons simply because they are avoided. It stores them. It allows silence to settle where expression once lived. And in that silence, something subtle begins to happen beneath awareness. Feelings that were not processed do not disappear. They remain active in the subconscious, quietly shaping perception, memory, and emotional response. At first, they may show up as occasional thoughts, small reminders that are quickly dismissed. But over time, they begin to grow in weight. What was once ignored becomes harder to suppress. Not because the external world is changing, but because the internal truth is refusing to stay buried. This is where the delayed awakening begins. It does not arrive as a dramatic moment of realization. It often enters through stillness, through repetition, through a sense that something unresolved keeps resurfacing in different forms. A song that triggers a memory, a quiet moment that feels heavier than expected, a new experience that does not fully replace what was left behind. The mind may try to rationalize it. It may say, "I made the right choice," or "it wasn't meant to be." But the heart does not respond to logic in the same way it responds to truth. And truth has a way of resurfacing when it is no longer being overridden by distraction. As time passes, emotional avoidance begins to reveal its cost. Not immediately, but gradually. The absence of what was once emotionally significant becomes more noticeable in moments of solitude, not because the past is idealized, but because the emotional impact of it was never fully processed. And what is not processed is not closed, it remains open energy in the psyche. In that openness, reflection begins to take shape, not as regret at first, but as questioning. A subtle wondering of why does this still affect me? Or why does this memory feel unresolved? And beneath those questions lies the deeper truth. The emotion was never fully felt when it needed to be. This is the turning point of internal awakening, when avoidance no longer protects but reveals. When distance no longer feels like freedom, but like unfinished emotional work. And what was once pushed away begins to return with greater intensity, not to harm, but to be acknowledged. Because emotions do not demand punishment, they demand presence. And when presence is delayed, their return feels amplified, not because they have grown stronger, but because they were never allowed to be expressed in their original form. In this way, emotional avoidance becomes its own teacher. It shows that what is not faced in the moment will eventually be faced in reflection, and what is not felt in real time will eventually be felt in memory, where it often carries more weight than it originally did. Silence after departure is often misunderstood as resolution, but for many, it is simply the absence of outward expression, while the inner world begins to speak more loudly. When communication ends, the surface may appear calm, even composed. There are no more messages to send, no more explanations to give, no more emotional exchanges to navigate. On the outside, it can resemble peace, but silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is the beginning of internal confrontation. For the one who chose to leave, silence can initially feel like relief. There is no emotional responsibility in the moment, no immediate tension. No vulnerability required. Life continues in a structured way, and the mind quickly adapts to the absence of interaction. New distractions emerge, routines shift, and the external world seems to move forward without disruption. But what is often overlooked is that emotional experiences do not dissolve simply because interaction has ended. The human mind has a remarkable ability to suppress emotional weight temporarily, but suppression is not the same as resolution. In silence, what once shared does not vanish, it becomes internalized. The absence of conversation creates space not for emptiness, but for reflection. And reflection, when it is unintentional, can become increasingly uncomfortable. At first, memories appear selectively. Small fragments of moments that were once dismissed begin to resurface without invitation. A familiar tone in someone else's voice, a place that carries emotional association, a routine moment that unexpectedly feels connected to the past. These are not coincidences, they are the mind reorganizing unresolved emotional material. And because there is no longer external engagement with the person involved, all of this processing happens inwardly, where it cannot be escaped as easily. Silence has a way of amplifying what was previously ignored. During interaction, attention is divided. There are responses to manage, emotions to navigate, and external stimuli that occupy awareness. But once that external engagement is removed, the mind then turns inward by default. And what it finds there is not always comfortable clarity, but unfinished emotional residue. In this space, silence begins to transform. It is no longer simply the absence of communication, it becomes a reflective environment. And within reflection, questions begin to surface. Not always directly, but subtly. Questions about choices, about timing, about emotional reactions that were not fully understood in the moment. The absence of immediate answers creates a mental didn't loop, where thoughts revisit similar points repeatedly, each time with slightly deeper awareness. This is where silence begins to act like a mirror. Not because it reflects the other person, but because it reflects the self. It reveals emotional patterns, avoidance tendencies, and moments that were previously justified without full understanding. And as this reflection deepens, the emotional distance that once felt liberating can begin to feel unfamiliar, even unsettled. There is also a quieter silence that often goes unnoticed at first. Emotional memory. The mind does not only store events, it stores emotional states associated with those events. When silence removes external stimulation, these internal emotional states become more accessible. This is why certain feelings can resurface unexpectedly, even when there is no conscious intention to revisit the past. Over time, silence can become heavier not because something new is happening, but because something unfinished is being internally processed without resolution. The absence of closure in communication creates a space where the mind attempts to create its own form of understanding. And this self-generated understanding is often shaped by reflection, reconsideration, and emotional reevaluation. In this way, silence is not passive. It is active in its own subtle form. It does not speak loudly, but it influences deeply. It reshapes perception gradually, allowing what was once dismissed to re-enter awareness in, or honest form. And as this continues, silence stops being just an external condition and becomes an internal experience of awakening awareness. What is walked away from in moments of emotional immaturity is rarely understood in the same depth at the time of departure as it is in the seasons that follow. In the moment of leaving, perception is often narrowed by immediate emotion, discomfort, or the desire to escape intensity. The mind prioritizes relief over reflection, and in doing so, it reduces something meaningful into something that feels temporarily manageable. But life does not allow emotional depth to remain reduced forever. It has a way of expanding understanding later when the noise has settled. Emotional immaturity is not always about age or experience. It is often about the capacity to hold complexity without rushing to escape it. When that capacity is not yet developed, emotional situations that require patience, communication, or inner stability can feel overwhelming. Instead of staying present with discomfort, the instinct becomes withdrawal. Instead of working through emotional tension, the instinct becomes distance. And in that distance, there is an illusion of control, because what feels intense in proximity feels quieter in absence. But absence does not erase emotional significance. It only delays engagement with it. When someone steps away from a connection that carried depth, they are not only stepping away from a person, but also from the emotional experiences that were tied to that connection. Those experiences do not disappear with physical or communicative separation. They remain stored in memory, in emotional imprint, and in subconscious association. In the immediate aftermath of leaving, there is often a sense of certainty. The mind creates narratives that justify the decision. It emphasizes discomfort over connection, differences over depth, and momentary frustration over long-term meaning. This mental framing provides temporary stability. It allows the person to move forward without sitting in emotional ambiguity. But what it does not account for is time. Time has a way of softening emotional intensity, but also revealing emotional truth. When the urgency of the moment fades, the mind begins to revisit what was once set aside. And it is in this revisiting that understanding begins to shift. What once felt like burden may begin to reveal itself as depth. What once felt like pressure may begin to reveal itself emotional significance that was not fully understood. There is also a subtle difference between experiencing something and comprehending its value. In emotionally immature moments, experience is felt, but value is not always recognized. It is only later, when comparison enters the picture, when other experiences lack the same emotional richness, that the mind begins to reassess what was left behind. This reassessment is not immediate regret, it is gradual recognition. Often, this recognition emerges in quiet moments, not in dramatic emotional breakdowns, but in simple instances where the present does not fully satisfy the emotional memory of the past. A conversation that lacks depth, a connection that feels surface level, a moment of solitude where the mind naturally drifts back to something that once felt more emotionally alive. These moments create contrast, and contrast leads to reflection. What was walked away from begins to take on new meaning, not because it has changed, but the perceiver has changed. Emotional maturity often develops through experience, and experience often includes loss, distance, and reflection. Through that process, understanding deepens. The same connection that was once seen through a limited lens begins to be seen with greater emotional awareness. There is also an important internal realization that often accompanies this shift. Emotional intensity is not the same as emotional incompatibility. What once felt overwhelming may have been unprocessed emotional depth. And what was avoided in the past may have been avoided not because it was wrong, but because it required a level of emotional presence that was not yet developed. As time continues, the mind begins to reconcile these layers. It starts to understand that leaving in a state of emotional immaturity does not erase what was meaningful. It only postpones the understanding of it, and that postponed understanding often arrives in reflection, where clarity is they didn't longer clouded by immediate emotional reaction, but guided by the quiet recognition of what was not fully seen at the time. Regret is rarely as loud as people imagine it to be. It does not always arrive with dramatic breakdowns or visible distress. More often, it enters quietly, almost unnoticed at first, like a subtle shift in internal atmosphere. It is not a single moment of realization, but a gradual accumulation of emotional awareness that begins to weigh on the mind in ways that are difficult to immediately name. At the surface level, life may appear unchanged after a decision to walk away. Routines continue, conversations happen, responsibilities are managed, and outwardly everything can seem intact. But beneath that surface, something begins to reorganize internally. The mind starts to revisit what it once dismissed, not because it is forced to, but because silence and time create space for reflection that was previously unavailable. Regret often begins as discomfort that hard to define. It is not immediately labeled as regret because the mind resists that interpretation. Instead, it shows up as restlessness, as subtle dissatisfaction, as a feeling that something is not fully settled. There may be moments where everything seems fine on the outside, yet internally there is a sense of emotional imbalance that cannot be fully resolved through distraction. One of the most powerful aspects of regret is that it does not rely on external validation to grow. It develops internally, through comparison between what is present and what is absent. When a connection once held emotional depth, that depth becomes a reference point. Even if it was not fully appreciated at the time, it remains stored in emotional memory. And when present experiences lack that same emotional resonance, the contrast becomes noticeable. This contrast is where regret quietly begins to form, not as immediate sorrow, but as recognition. The mind starts to revisit past interactions with new awareness. Conversations that once seemed ordinary begin to reveal emotional meaning that was not fully understood in the moment. Small gestures, moments of care, or emotional presence that were previously overlooked begin to take on greater significance in hindsight. There is also a psychological aspect to regret that often intensifies it over time, the realization of irreversibility. When the mind understands that something cannot simply be returned to its original state, emotional increases. It is not just about what was lost, but about the awareness that the version of self who had access to that experience no longer exists in the same context. This creates a layered emotional response that includes reflection, longing, and sometimes quiet self-questioning. Regret also tends to deepen in solitude. In the absence of external validation or distraction, the mind has more space to process emotional residue. In these quieter moments, thoughts that were previously pushed aside begin to surface more clearly. There is no immediate escape into conversation or activity, so the internal world becomes more active. And in that activity, emotional truths that were once ignored begin to gain clarity. It is important to understand that regret is not always about wanting to return to the past. Often, it is about finally understanding the past more deeply than was possible at the time of experience. It is the mind recognizing emotional value after distance has effective. This recognition can be both enlightening and uncomfortable because it reveals that what was once taken for granted carried more significance than was realized. As this awareness grows, regret can take on different forms. Sometimes it appears as quiet reflection, where memories are revisited with a new emotional lens. Sometimes it appears as internal questioning, where decisions are reevaluated without the ability to change their outcome. And sometimes it appears as emotional stillness, where the absence of what once existed becomes more noticeable than any present distraction. Yet even in its discomfort, regret carries a deeper function. It forces emotional awareness to expand beyond immediate perception. It challenges the mind to understand that decisions made in one emotional state may be understood differently in another. And in doing so, it reveals the layered nature of human experience, where understanding is not fixed in the moment but continues to evolve long after the moment has passed. The soul does not operate on the same timeline as the mind. While the mind can convince itself to move forward, to rationalize, to detach, and to reframe experiences in ways that feel manageable, the deeper emotional imprint of connection often remains untouched by those mental adjustments. The soul, in a symbolic sense, holds onto experiences not as thoughts, but as energetic imprints, impressions formed through emotional presence, vulnerability, and meaning. When a connection is formed at a meaningful level, it creates more than memory. It creates familiarity at a deeper emotional layer, one that is not easily erased by distance or time. Even when the mind insists that something is over, the emotional imprint of that connection can remain active beneath awareness. This is why certain experiences resurface unexpectedly, even when a person believes they have fully moved on. At the time of separation, the mind often takes control of interpretation. It creates narratives that justify the ending. It may emphasize incompatibility, timing, or external circumstances as reasons to emotionally close the chapter. These narratives are not necessarily false, but they are often incomplete. They represent understanding from a limited emotional perspective, one shaped by immediacy rather than depth. The soul's memory, however, does not rely on justification. It retains emotional resonance. It remembers how something felt at its core, not felt was explained afterward. This is why, even after someone consciously detaches, there can still be moments where emotional echoes return without warning. A feeling of familiarity in an unfamiliar place. A sudden emotional wave triggered by something unrelated. A quiet sense of absence that is difficult to define. These experiences are not always dramatic. In fact, they are often subtle. A pause in thought that lingers longer than expected. A memory that arises without effort, a moment, emotional softness that seems disconnected from the present environment. These are ways in which the deeper emotional imprint reasserts itself, not to disrupt life, but to reveal that not everything has been fully integrated. The soul's memory is not linear. It does not move from beginning to end in a structured way. Instead, it moves through resonance. What carries emotional significance remains accessible, even when consciously ignored. This is why certain connections feel difficult to fully replace. It is not about comparison in a logical sense, but about emotional familiarity that exists beneath conscious reasoning. Over time, this can create an internal tension between what the mind has decided and what the deeper emotional layer still recognizes. The mind may say, "This is over," while something quieter within responds with recognition that feels unfinished. Not unfinished in a literal sense, but unfinished in emotional integration. The experience has been lived, but not fully processed at every level of awareness. This is where reflection begins to deepen. Not as obsession or longing, but as quiet revisiting of emotional truth. The mind starts to remember not only events, but emotional states. How presence felt. How connection altered internal experience. How certain moments carried meaning that was not fully acknowledged at the time. In this process, the soul's memory becomes less about attachment and more about awareness. It reveals that emotional connections are not easily compartmentalized. They leave traces within perception, shaping how future experiences are felt and interpreted. Even when someone moves into new environments or new relationships, they must be prepared to adapt and grow. These internal traces can subtly influence emotional response, sometimes without conscious recognition. There is also an important realization that often emerges through this kind of reflection. Emotional presence cannot be fully replicated by replacement. New experiences may offer different forms of connection, but they do not erase the imprint of what was deeply felt. Instead, they coexist, creating layers of emotional experience that shape how a person understands intimacy, connection, and absence. The soul remembers not to bind a person to the past, but to preserve emotional truth. And sometimes what returns in memory is not meant to pull someone backward, but to show them the depth of what they once experienced, so that they can better understand the depth they are capable of feeling. Then, they didn't again. Life does not only respond to choices, it teaches through them. And some of the most profound lessons are not delivered through comfort, but through consequence. When emotional decisions are made impulsively, without full awareness or inner alignment, life does not immediately correct them with explanation. Instead, it allows the experience to unfold, so that understanding is not borrowed from advice, but earned through lived reality. When someone leaves a meaningful connection from a phase of emotional immaturity or avoidance, the initial feeling is often relief or justification. There is a sense of closure created by the mind, even if the heart has not fully processed what was left behind. But life does not rely on that initial interpretation. It continues forward, allowing time and experience to reveal what was not visible in the moment of decision. At first, the consequences of emotional decisions are subtle. They do not arrive as punishment or disruption, but as absence. The absence of certain emotional depth, the absence of familiarity that once felt grounding. The absence of connection that once provided meaning, even if it was not fully appreciated at the time. And it is often in this absence that life begins its quiet teaching. What makes these lessons powerful is that they are not immediate. If understanding came instantly, it could be dismissed or rationalized away. But when understanding arrives gradually, through repeated experience and reflection, it becomes harder to ignore. Life allows contrast to form. It allows a person to experience different emotional environments, so that comparison becomes a natural form of awareness. In new experiences, something begins to stand out, not necessarily in an obvious way, but in emotional texture. Conversations may feel different. Emotional depth may feel inconsistent. Moments of connection may feel present but not fully resonant. And without consciously trying to compare, the mind begins to notice. But didn't differences between what is currently experienced and what was once known? This is how life teaches without explanation. It creates awareness through lived contrast. It does not tell a person directly what was right or wrong. Instead, it allows emotional memory to interact with present experience, so that understanding arises internally rather than externally. And this kind of understanding is far more difficult to dismiss, because it is felt rather than instructed. There is also a deeper layer, to these lessons that involves emotional responsibility. Life often reflects back the level of emotional presence a person was capable of giving at the time of decision. If someone was not fully present in a connection, they may later encounter situations that challenge them to understand presence more deeply. If someone avoided emotional depth, they may later experience the absence of that depth in ways that bring awareness to its value. This is not punishment in a literal sense. It is that they didn't alignment. Life tends to guide individuals toward greater emotional awareness through experience, not through explanation. And when emotional decisions are made without that awareness, the resulting experiences often serve as the teacher. As time continues, reflection becomes more natural, not forced, but inevitable. The mind begins to revisit choices not with immediate judgment, but with curiosity. Why did that feel overwhelming? Why was distance chosen over understanding? Why does the present feel different from what was once known, even if it appears stable on the surface? These questions are not always conscious, but they shape emotional perception. They influence how new experiences are interpreted. They create subtle shifts in awareness that slowly reframe the past, not to erase it, but to understand it more accurately. Life also teaches through emotional maturity that develops after experience. What was once reacted to impulsively may later be approached with patience. What was they didn't once avoided may later be understood as something that required presence rather than escape. And in this evolution, the earlier emotional decision becomes part of a larger learning process. Over time, it becomes clear that life does not waste emotional experience. Even decisions that were made without full awareness become part of a deeper unfolding. They shape emotional intelligence, refine perception, and expand the ability to understand both self and others. In this way, life's lessons are not isolated events. They are continuous reflections, gently guiding awareness toward greater depth. And what begins as emotional consequence eventually becomes emotional understanding, revealing that every experience, even the difficult ones, carries a form of instruction that only time can fully translate. There is a profound shift that occurs when a person begins to understand that not every ending requires pursuit, and not every absence demands repair. Human nature often resists endings, especially when emotional attachment has been involved. The instinct is to chase clarity, to seek reconnection, or to mentally replay scenarios in search of a different outcome. But emotional evolution begins when a person realizes that not all doors are meant to be reopened, and not all paths are meant to be revisited. Healing is often misunderstood as returning something to its original form. In reality, healing is transformation. It is the process of becoming someone who no longer requires same conditions to feel whole. It is not about restoring what was, but about integrating what was experienced into a deeper understanding of self. And this process cannot be rushed through external validation or the return of what was lost. When a meaningful connection ends, the mind may initially focus outward. It may search for reasons, explanations, or possibilities of return. It may attempt to assign responsibility or reconstruct scenarios where the outcome could have been different, but over time, something important begins to shift inward. The focus slowly moves from what happened between us to what is happening within me because of this. This inward shift is where true growth begins. Because emotional endings are not only about relationships with others, they are also about relationships with the self. How one processes loss, how one responds to absence, how one understands emotional value after distance has created perspective. These internal responses reveal more about personal evolution than the external situation ever could. The deeper purpose behind emotional endings is not always immediately visible. In the moment, endings can feel like disruption or confusion. They can create emotional voids that seem difficult to fill. But over time, those voids often become spaces for reflection, self-awareness, and emotional restructuring. What was once external attachment begins to transform into internal understanding. There is also a quiet but powerful truth that emerges through emotional separation. Wholeness was never dependent on another person. It may have felt that way in moments of connection, but emotional dependency often masks an underlying truth that the capacity for fulfillment must ultimately be rooted within. When someone leaves, they do not remove completeness, they remove attachment. And in that removal, what remains is an opportunity to rediscover inner stability. This is where growth becomes subtle but profound. Instead of chasing what was lost, attention begins to shift toward what is being built internally. Emotional resilience develops not through avoidance of pain, but through understanding it. Clarity develops not through return, but through reflection. And strength develops not through resistance to change, but through acceptance of it. As this process continues, the memory of what was left behind does not necessarily disappear, but its emotional charge changes. It becomes less about longing and more about understanding, about absence and more about integration. The experience becomes part of personal history, rather than an unresolved emotional pull. There is also a deeper liberation that comes with this realization. When a person stops attempting to force reconnection with what has ended, emotional energy is redirected inward. That energy begins to support growth, self-awareness, and emotional grounding. Life no longer feels anchored to what was lost, but to what is being developed within. And in this space, a subtle form of peace begins to emerge. Not the kind of peace that depends on external circumstances, but the kind that comes from alignment with reality.